shining, in the midst of the darkness shining. Jesus, light of the world, shine upon us, set us free by the truth you now bring us. Shine on me, shine on me, shine, Jesus, shine, fill this land with the Father's glory. Blaze, Spirit, blaze, set our hearts on fire. Flow, river, flow, flood the nations with grace and mercy. Send forth your word, Lord, and let there be light.
Good morning, and thank you so much for joining me this morning on Let the Bible Speak. My name is Alex Meredith. I'm the minister for the Church of Christ in Marquette. You may notice that we're still outside the studio recording from the church building. We are still doing remote recording. The studio is trying to limit traffic going in and out of the studio. They're trying to be careful and safe as COVID cases continue to rise in the area. Certainly, by the way, be in prayer about that. To start off, I wanted to talk to you about a few questions that people have. And I wonder if you've ever asked questions like this. Questions like, is God listening? Is God ignoring me? God, are you there? Sometimes it feels like God isn't listening. And really, we're not the only ones asking these questions. These are biblical questions. There are biblical writers who ask questions like these. I want to give you a few examples. The first one we find in Psalm chapter 10. Psalm chapter 10, verse 1, listen to this question. Why, O Lord, do you stand far away? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble? And then in picking up in verse 10, the helpless are crushed, sink down and fall by his might. He says in his heart, God has forgotten. He has hidden his face. He will never see it. Arise, O Lord. O God, lift up your hand. Forget not the afflicted. Psalm 22. Another example of good question. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me from the words of my groaning? Oh my God, I cry to you by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but I find no rest. This psalm is quoted by Jesus himself as he's crucified on the cross. Why? Why have you forsaken me? And then in Psalm 28 verses 1 and 2, to you, O Lord, I call, my rock, be not deaf to me, lest if you be silent to me, I become like those who go down to the pit. Hear the voice of my pleas for mercy. When I cry to you for help, when I lift up my hands toward your most holy sanctuary. Sometimes it feels like God isn't listening. Now, these questions don't necessarily always depict reality. Just because it feels like God isn't listening, does that mean that God isn't listening? Well, no. So they don't always reflect reality, but they do reflect our emotions. And sometimes, again, it feels like God isn't listening. Today we are continuing in our series, The Story of the Bible, and where we're going from the beginning to the end of the Bible. This is now, I believe, part 4 of the series. We started off by talking about creation. God created all things perfect. God created things exactly the way that he had intended in the beginning. And then we talked about rebellion, how sin enters the picture and distorts God's creation. God and mankind are separated, and all of these terrible things begin happening in the world. And then we talked about covenant. We talked about how God began to address the sin problem in the world, and he did so by making a covenant with a man named Abraham. And this was the beginning of God's rescue mission. Well, that rescue mission continues today, and it continues in our lesson. And today, our topic is Exodus. So we've talked about creation, we've talked about rebellion, we've talked about covenant. Now our topic is Exodus. And I hope, just like last week, I hope that we can accomplish two things in this series. One, I hope that we are able to advance the story. I hope that we're able to see the progression of the Bible and how the sequence of events flows together. And the second thing I want to accomplish, though, as well, is I hope that we are able to see God's character as it is revealed through this story. Because in any story, the main people involved in the story, you get to learn something about who they are, right? And the Bible is no different. As we go through the Bible and we see all of these interactions between God, between mankind, we get to see the nature and character of God. And so we're putting emphasis on both the story and its progression and on the character of God as we see it form and revealed throughout the story. Now, I know I'm talking about Exodus, and we only got to Genesis 22 last week, so there's a bit of a gap here. Leading up to Exodus, there's a lot that's happened. Now, I'm going to attempt to give you the short version of the story up to this point. So we left off talking about Abraham and Isaac. Abraham and Sarah give birth to Isaac, and then this promise, this covenant that was given to Abraham of land, of a great nation, of all the families of the earth being blessed through him. That promise was then passed down to Isaac. And then it was passed down to Jacob, Isaac's son. If you remember the story of Jacob and Esau, that's in there somewhere. So the promise didn't go to Esau, but it goes to Jacob. And then, with Jacob, this covenant is applicable not just to one son, but to all of his descendants. The covenant that God gave to Abraham is given to Jacob and all of his descendants after him. Now, if you remember, in the time of Jacob, he had several sons. Among those sons was a boy named Joseph. And Joseph, you could say, was sort of his favorite, right? Seemed like it anyway. At least it seemed like it to his brothers. Jacob gave Joseph this colorful coat at one point, and his brothers were jealous of him. And in response to this jealousy, they did some pretty evil and wicked things to him. They threw him down in a pit. They brought this cloth with blood on it to Jacob, their father, told him, look, your son Joseph, he's dead. So they faked his death, and really what they did was they kept him in this pit, and then they saw some wandering traders, and they sold him as a slave to these traders. So these traders, he got passed around some, but ultimately he ended up in the land of Egypt. We know about ancient Egypt, right? He ended up in Egypt in the time of the pharaohs and all of that. Well, because of God working through Joseph, through interpreting these dreams and having interaction with people in high power and high places, Joseph rose through the ranks. He was originally nothing when he got there, but he rose through the ranks and became pretty much second in power, right? So he was very influential in Egypt. Now, relating to one of the dreams that Joseph helped interpret, actually, Egypt was well prepared for a famine that was about to spread through the whole land. Well, this famine not only affected Egypt, it affected Canaan. It affected Jacob and where his family was and Joseph's brothers were. And so this famine struck the land, and the brothers went looking for food. Well, they go down to Egypt, they find food, but they also find Joseph there. It's a long story, but again, we're condensing down for the sake of progressing the story. So, long story short, Joseph invites his entire family, Jacob and his other sons, to move to Egypt. So they all move and settle in the land of Egypt. Now, after a short time, as it happened in any kingdom, a new ruler came to power, a new Pharaoh in this instance. And this new Pharaoh didn't know didn't know Joseph, didn't know who the Israelites really were, didn't respect their place in the land. And in fact, it was definitely not a place of respect. He was actually afraid of the Israelites. He was afraid that they posed this threat of potential rebellion, or that they would try to seize power from the hand of the native Egyptians. And so in response to this, and you can see the description of this in Exodus 1, verses 8 through 14, in response to this, they're enslaved. They're enslaved, and we're told that the cries of the Israelites went up before God. They were having a terrible, awful time. And I wonder, when I read sections of Scripture like that, it makes me wonder, where was God? What was he doing? Was he listening? Was he ignoring them? Because I wonder, sometime in that 400-year period, and that's what it ended up being, 400 years of slavery. Do you think after 400 years it ever seemed like God had just forgotten about them? Do you think that he had forgotten about the promises that he had made to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, their forefathers? Do you think that he just walked away and just left the world entirely? Do you think it ever felt like God was just not listening? Probably, right? Their cries were going up for 400 years, but they didn't go unanswered. I want to look at Exodus chapter 3. Exodus chapter 3, we're going to read verses 1 through 12. So beginning in verse 1, now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro, the priest of Midian. And he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of the bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. When God saw that he turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Do not come near. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place which you are standing is holy ground. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And now, behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppress them. Come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? He said, But I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. Did you catch that? Verse 7 is the first place we see it. I have seen their affliction, the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry. God was listening. Now let's tackle the elephant in the room. It's been 400 years, right? It's been 400 years, and just now, after all this time, God is finally responding, and God is finally going to do something about the affliction of the people of Israel. And the question has to be, why? Why did he come 400 years too late? Well, that's a difficult question, and it's hard to ascertain God's motives, but I will say this. God works on his own time. God works on his own time, and for whatever reason, God believed that at this time, with these people present, with the amount of multiplication that the Israelites have had after these 400 years, beginning this journey to the promised land, now was the right time to act. In God's wisdom, God acted for the benefit of his people. I can't tell you a definite answer on why God chose that time. I have my suspicions, but God in his wisdom works on his own time. And he was listening the whole time. He just didn't answer on their time, right? So what happens next? God tells Moses that he's going to go before Pharaoh, plead for the release of his people, and that's what he does. He goes, in fact, with a man named Aaron, and they both go before Pharaoh and request to Pharaoh, let my people go. Well, of course, Pharaoh refuses. He refuses to let the Israelites go. And in response, God sends all of these plagues to the Egyptians to persuade Pharaoh, you need to let them go or else. And so all of these plagues fall upon the Egyptians, one after another, after another, after another. You have 10 plagues in total. What I want to focus in on is the final plague. And by the way, after each of these times, Pharaoh has another chance to release the people of Israel. He continues to refuse to do so. Well, I want to look at the final plague. I'll just read a couple of pieces of the description of it. This is from Exodus chapter 11, beginning in verse 4. So Moses said, thus says the Lord, about midnight I will go out in the midst of Egypt, and every firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sits on his throne, even to the firstborn of the slave girl, who is behind the handmill, and all the firstborn of the cattle. There shall be a great cry throughout all the land of Egypt, such as there has never been, nor ever will be again. And then picking up in chapter 12, beginning in verse 12, for I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast. And on all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord. So there are two really important things to remember here in this event that becomes known as the Passover. First of all, we see that God is willing to spare the Israelites from having to face this plague through the blood of the lamb, right? The Israelite households are supposed to slaughter a lamb, and they take the blood of the lamb and then they spread it on the doorposts of the houses that they're in, right? And when God would see this blood, he would pass over those houses. Notice something here, and we're not going to get too much into this, but think about this. In every house, something died, right? In the presence of God, sin is punished, and in every house there was a punishment for sin, whether that was taken on by the grace of God by an animal or by the firstborn of these families, right? In every house, something died. But God spares the Israelites through the blood of the Lamb. Now the second thing, and this is really important, God, through the Passover event, is showing his unmatched power and compassion. Unmatched power and compassion. Now the reason I bring this up, and I want to focus in on this final part of verse 12 of chapter 12, and on all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. Why is that important? And why would God say it that way? There's only one God. There's only one God with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and he's the only true God. There is none other beside him. Why does God say it this way? Well, think about this. For 400 years, the Israelites have been living in Egypt. 400 years. I don't know exactly how many generations that is, but that's a long time. And after all this time, the Israelites almost certainly would have assimilated some of the culture of the Egyptians, including their own pantheon of gods and goddesses and worship of idols, right? Well, what this is doing after this 400-year period, what this Passover event is doing is showing the Israelites, there is nobody with power like me. There is nobody with compassion like me that is willing to free you from the slavery. Nobody else has acted in this way. Nobody else can act in this way. I'm the only one who's done it. Right? It's to show the Israelites the supreme power and compassion of God above all other so-called gods or goddesses, right? So that they have this shift, hopefully. I say hopefully because we know what happens later down the line. They would hopefully have this shift from this polytheistic mindset where there are several gods to understanding that there is really only one true God. And this is the beginning of leading them to that idea, I think. So God's deliverance, and God does deliver them after this final plague befalls the Egyptians. They beg the Israelites to leave. They later change their mind, or Pharaoh changes his mind and begins to pursue them, but God will deliver them from that too. And this really began this journey that we see progress through Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, where they are going through the wilderness of Sinai, or in Exodus and Leviticus, staying at Sinai, the Mount of Horeb, by the way, which is exactly what God had said, right? And it started this journey for them that would lead them to the Promised Land, to the land of Canaan. And that was the big goal in the beginning of the Bible, to lead the Israelites to the Promised Land. Now, what's important to say here about this is this journey really represents God's first attempt to restore Eden. And here's why I say that. Look at Exodus chapter 6. I'm going to back up to there. Exodus chapter 6, beginning in verse 2. Listen to how this promise is described. God spoke to Moses and said to him, I am the Lord. I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as God Almighty. But by my name, the Lord, I did not make myself known to them. I also established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, the land in which they lived as sojourners. Moreover, I have heard the groaning of the people of Israel, whom the Egyptians hold as slaves, and I have remembered my covenant. Say, therefore, to the people of Israel, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians, and I will deliver you from slavery to them, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and great axe, and with great acts of judgment. I will take you to be my people, and I will be your God, and you shall know that I am the Lord, who has brought you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. I will bring you into the land that I swore to give to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. I will give it to you for a possession. I am the Lord. Moses spoke thus to the people of Israel, but they did not listen to Moses because of their broken spirit and harsh slavery. Well, the Israelites may have been skeptical, but God certainly would fulfill his promise. The promise that God made Abraham all the way back in Genesis chapter 12 to go to this new land, that promise was going to be fulfilled by the Israelites making this journey to the land of Canaan. And the Exodus began that journey. And maybe you heard some of the language in there. You will be my people and I will be your God. Do you know what other book we hear that language in? Few places, but I'm thinking about the book of Revelation. All the way to the end of the Bible, where you have this picture of heaven, where things are going to be exactly the way that God intended for them to be. Israel was God's first attempt to make that work. God was going to dwell in the midst of the people of Israel. God was going to bless them and to take care of them, and in response, the people of Israel would live as his people. Will they continue that faithfulness? Well, we'll find out, but I suspect that many of you already know the answer. Going back to the situation here in Exodus, though, God listened to his people, and God chose to respond to the suffering of his people in this manner, by releasing them from slavery in Egypt. That's how God chose to answer suffering of his people then. And really, that's how God chooses to answer the suffering of his people today. God has given us a Passover lamb. who is going to lead us to our promised land. Of course, when we talk about our Passover lamb, we're talking about Jesus. When we talk about the promised land, we're talking about heaven, a place without any suffering. I'll go to one place here where you see this sort of language. This is in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 7. It says, "Cleanse out the old leaven that you may be a new lump, as you really are unleavened. For Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed." You have some of the same language that's recalled all the way back from the New Testament to describe Jesus. And really, the Exodus does point to Jesus. I know I seem like I'm getting ahead of myself here, but that's the truth of the matter. The Exodus, really the whole Bible, points towards Jesus, because the whole goal, the whole point of the Bible is addressing this question of how does God answer the sin problem, get rid of sin to put the world to rights? How does God get things back to the way they're supposed to be? He tried to do that through the Israelites. That doesn't work because of Israelites' unfaithfulness. We'll talk more about that next week. But ultimately, this takes place through the person of Jesus Christ. We've got some material left here. I may pick up on some of this next week. We'll see how things go. But before I wrap up here, and I'm about to run out of time, I wanted to tell you about the Bible course we offer. We do offer a Bible course that comes in the form of several workbooks. It's a series of workbooks. Just let us know that you want to participate. If you're going to participate in this series or in following along with this story, you need a Bible, and we want to offer one to you. It's a hardback ESV Bible, the same version we use here on the show. If you want any of that, there's contact information on the screen. I hope you have a wonderful week. We'll pick up next week with the story of Israel's rebellion. God bless.
Father's glory blaze, Spirit blaze, set our hearts on fire.